It is Wednesday, November 22nd, 2017. I'm Gord Long. As is normally the case, we have a lot of charts for us to go through this morning, so therefore we will pass over some of them quickly, but leave you to examine them further at your leisure. You'll need to open your viewer to full screen viewing, or you'll not be able to see some of the detail I'll be discussing in the charts. A reminder before we begin, do not trade from any of these slides. They are for educational and discussion purposes only. The purpose of the audio is to discuss key developments in those areas not specifically updated in this month's macro online updates. The research document this month updates regional macro developments. Therefore, the slides this morning will focus on our other three report areas of our monthly report: global risk, macro, and U.S. economic developments. As I so often do, I like to tie them together into a general discussion concerning what I see as a potential looming cascading and collapsing collateral crisis. I would therefore like to go over the items outlined here. I discussed this chart in the November long wave video regarding my speculative views on what may lie ahead for us financially, economically, and politically. Because of time, I was unable to elaborate in the video on why I specifically saw a collateral failure ahead, which would force the triggering of the next round of central bank and government policy adoptions. I would refer new viewers to that November long wave video for more detail on my expected policy initiatives, since I want to focus today instead on what is the foundation issues of why I see cascading and collapsing collateral values on the horizon. It is important to fully appreciate that the banking system sees the world differently than most business models. This stems from the basic underpinnings of how banks actually do their accounting. Non-bank businesses see their financial balance sheet as containing assets and liabilities, where debt is a liability and cash is an asset. Banks, on the other hand, account for debt as an asset and cash, on the other hand, or deposits, as a liability. This makes sense for banks, as their prime asset is the creation of debt, while cash deposits of their depositors are liabilities that must someday be returned. That is, in the old days it was returned with interest on those deposits, but not so much today. The world of fractional reserve banking, which evolved from the dubious practice of gold clipping, was basically a formalized approach to this practice when people shifted to exchanging paper notes instead of gold for trade. To keep things on the up and up, bank regulators were put in place to police banks, to keep prescribed reserve ratios in place. Historically, they used to be 10 to 1. Banks could only lend out $10 for every $1 deposit. That isn't the case anymore, as banks have cleverly had rules and regulations steadily changed, but we will leave that for another discussion. The quasi-government Federal Reserve is responsible for enforcement of the banks who solely sit on the boards of the regional reserve banks. No obvious conflict of interest here. We'll assume everything is on the up and up, though. We learned during the 2007 financial crisis this just wasn't the case with the too big to fail banks. This prompted numerous national mortgage suits and the creation of the complex Dodd-Frank legislation, now, by the way, being quietly dismantled. Again, we'll leave this for another day. Instead, I want to move to the murky world of international banking, where there are no regulators. There are Bank of International Settlements banking recommendations and Basel Accord agreements by the banks, but no one polices, no one enforces, and no investigation of these global banks happens on a worldwide basis. I'm not trying to suggest anything is obviously wrong here, just pointing out the frank reality. On the left, we see what we do know. A U.S. bank practicing banking as we are told it works. Of the $10 that is lent out for every $1 deposited, we see that the depositor may deposit that borrowed dollar in a foreign bank. Individuals may not do a lot of this, but corporations and financial institutions do, and since the advent of globalization in a dramatically expanded fashion, trillions of dollars as a matter of fact. Once that money is deposited in a foreign bank, it becomes a bank liability for that bank, but then allows them to create $10 or more to be lent out. China, for example, allows over 20 to 1. You can see how $1 can multiply quickly and exponentially. This is one of the reasons for explosive globalization and why giant global emerging mercantile players such as Japan and China had the money for expansion, since coming off sound money and the gold standard in 1971 and adopting a fiat currency regime, international balance of payments, which previously settled in gold, now settled international payments with credit. The only impediment to explosive and endless debt growth is the reality of the lending. Lenders normally want assurances they will get their freshly created money back, and as such have historically demanded collateral being posted to secure the loan. Therein lies the rub. Do these countries have the wealth to secure these loans? If the money is for a power generation plant, let's say in Indonesia, then the plant and the government tax assurances could be used for collateral. This was the world of the late 70s and 80s. Quickly, banks wanted to expand lending even faster, but where was the collateral for it to come from? In the U.S., the domestic banks solved this growth problem through the creation of securitization. Securitization turns a stream of debt, payments like mortgages, car payments, business accounts receivables, into an income-generating asset. It exploded in the U.S. and is a basic building block of the massive U.S. debt edifice and at the center of the 2007 financial crisis. Though it was stalled in the aftermath of the great financial crisis, it has reemerged again via $1 trillion and more in car loans and $1.4 trillion in student loans, while still financing nearly 95% of all U.S. mortgages through government guarantees and the conservatorships of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. But let's get back to the international banks. What did they do to create the collateral to spur lending? Well, obviously, they sold U.S. securitization products to other countries where they were both treated as deposits to create lending, but also as collateral from non-banks to secure loans. But this still wasn't enough. What they then did is conjured up a concept called swaps, using such new legal terminology as novation and rehypothecation, whereby a business or government entity with a bond in one country could swap it for an equivalent valued bond in another country, of course adjusted for interest rate, duration, and currency. This sleight of hand has fostered a $500 to $600 trillion global swaps market, supported by a global economy of only $74 trillion approximately. To even a newbie, this seems questionable, but who is to question it? There are, of course, real economic advantages for international corporations and financial institutions to do this. But the real value here is that banks can use the same bonds for collateral in multiple countries. Presto, instant collateral. That is, as long as everyone can and does fulfill their agreements. The global swaps market is completely unregulated, over-the-counter, that is an OTC market, and completely opaque, no visibility. There is a lot of room for major games to be played here to control global interest rates and currency values by the major international banks, the same banks who have been prosecuted and found guilty for fixing LIBOR, gold prices, money laundering, and other nefarious shenanigans. Trump change actually compared to the global swaps game. Let's switch from debt to credit. Here we switch from collateral to guarantees or the perceived assurances of payment. We can use the U.S. debt as an example everyone is familiar with. We are told it is $20 trillion, the U.S. debt, but in fact it is actually closer to $84 trillion when unfunded liabilities such as Social Security, Medicare, and other entitlements are properly accounted for. Businesses are legally held to such practices, but not the government. Unlike the private sector, the government has none of this money set aside. It has spent all the contributions made for these entitlements. How will these be funded? No one has a clue, nor is presently even willing to seriously discuss it. Somehow these entitlements are going to be paid, at least to some degree, and are therefore going to require financing. That lies ahead of us, and it will be interesting as an aside to see what collateral will be used for its funding. But it gets worse, since the U.S. debt is not $84 trillion, but actually approximates $215 trillion. This is called the fiscal gap, and it includes all the promises and guarantees the U.S. government has made on the taxpayers' behalf. These guarantees come in various forms, but are often what accountants call contingent liabilities. When the U.S. bails out a country, it doesn't actually give them the money. The banks lend the money to the recipient countries at, frankly, an enormous rate, knowing they'll probably default on it, but payment defaults are guaranteed by the U.S. government. The banks can't lose as long as the U.S. government meets its commitments. Since it is perceived that the U.S. government can print the money if it needs to, the fiscal gap is not get counted for as real debt. But it certainly is. The real issue is that more money in terms of lending is being created, but here it is not based on collateral, but the perceived ability of the government to fulfill its promises. This is what credit is. Credit is different than debt. Credit is about lender's ability to pay or fulfill its obligations. The loan is unsecured by collateral or only partially secured. The terms are often such that it is questionable if there are any real penalties for possible non-payment. For the banks, which can conjure up loans out of thin air, it is only about risk. If the money is free, there is really little risk, as long as the borrowers can stay solvent. Now we're getting to the crux of the credit problem, borrowers staying solvent. When growth slows, as it does during the normal business cycle, solvency becomes a problem. And as Warren Buffett often warns, to quote him, when the water goes out, you find out who was swimming naked. What has rapidly emerged in the credit market is a $74 trillion shadow banking system. These are financial intermediaries operating outside the realm of the banking regulators. These are payers such as credit default swap issuers. We were all educated on these during the great financial crisis. Hedge funds, private equity, mortgage lenders, right down to payday loan outfits. These players create money in a different fashion, but nevertheless create money through credit. At approximately $74 trillion, they are now the size of the global economy. Yet another astounding fact. What this explosion in global availability of credit and growing debt obligations has done is made debt less costly and less valuable. It has also made it more risky and speculative for those doing the lending. With lending rates artificially low, for the sustained period we have had since the 2008 financial crisis, when we fully entered the area of the macroprudential policy of financial repression, we have completely distorted the capital markets. With concepts such as novation and rehypothecation, which we first identified in our 2010 Sultans of Swap article series, we have come to a point of completely distorted lending risk. Economic growth can no longer support the debt load and is consuming investable capital and wealth-creating capital. Global debt at approximately $215 trillion and costing in the air 4% is consuming global economic growth. It is unsustainable. Obviously, anything that is unsustainable doesn't last. What we need to fully grasp is that debt is becoming increasingly impaired and the ability to pay debt burdens is steadily being destroyed. Amazon, for example, is a disruptive business model that both creates value but also destroys existing value through creative destruction. It sells and distributes products far cheaper than retail stores, creating value for Amazon shareholders, but concurrently destroying the value for massive numbers of existing brick-and-mortar retail players who have failed to effectively embrace online retailing. For every dollar of value Amazon creates, it is presently destroying hundreds of dollars for existing players. That destruction is effectively the destruction of collateral in the highly leveraged corporation of today. Like a moat around a castle, once the moat is removed, the castle is less valuable. It may actually become a liability, as, for example, the Blitzkrieg in the Second World War abruptly obsoleted trench warfare from the First World War. A disruptive technology does this. New approaches also do this. Unfortunately, the collateral value of the castle plummets as the collateral value is seriously and hopelessly impaired. When sales fall, cash flows fall. Credit ratings weaken. Debt becomes more expensive, and more collateral is normally demanded to support existing debt. Delinquencies and default often rapidly rise as companies force sales growth, and therefore their debt becomes impaired. Additionally, credit and debt becomes harder to secure as much-needed collateral becomes harder to come by. Impaired enterprise value and collateral values are all around us, and it is obvious to anyone willing to look. Toys R Us, was forced into bankruptcy proceedings because its debt levels were too high for falling sales and margins to support. IBM, years of steady falling quarterly top-line sales have reduced cash flows, and despite borrowing to support buybacks and dividends, its credit rating is now exposed. Falling IBM stock value is not only bad for IBM, but also investors using the stock price for margin and pledged collateral needs. GE, with similar problems to IBM, has slashed its dividend by 50%. The enterprise value of the corporation was dramatically sliced. So, in closing, we have some serious problems here, and I fully am expecting to see some sort of collateral implosion ahead of us. But remember, the answer will be that they will print more money. It is the only answer politicians will ever agree, and as you can see, these are the kinds of policies that we can expect going forward after the collateral contagion collapse that I foresee. So, knowing this, invest accordingly. I'd like to take a moment as a reminder, do not trade from any of these slides. They are for educational and discussion purposes only. As negative as these comments often are, there has seldom actually been a better time for investing. However, it requires careful analysis and not following what has traditionally been the true and tried approaches. To do this, you need to do your reading and make sure you have a knowledgeable and well-informed financial advisor. So until we talk again, may the remainder of 2017 turn out to be an outstanding investment year for you and your family. I thank you for listening.